Welcome to All Night Society. Listen carefully, because these stories actually happened. I used to exchange holiday cards with a man who had 4 human heads in his freezer. His name was Arthur Vance. He was the kind of neighbor who mowed his lawn at exactly 8 in the morning every Saturday. He always wore those beige cargo shorts and a clean white t-shirt. For 3 years, we lived next door to him and thought he was the most boring man in the world. He worked as a technician for a medical supply company and kept his hedges trimmed to a perfect cube. The first time I felt something was off was during a heat wave in July. Our houses were close enough that I could see into his side yard from my kitchen window. The power went out across the neighborhood, and everyone was outside complaining on their porches. But not Arthur. He was frantically unloading bags of ice from his trunk and carrying them into his garage. He didn't look like a man worried about his steak spoiling. He looked terrified. I stood there by my sink, watching him through the blinds. He dropped a bag, and instead of picking it up, he just stared at his front door for a full minute. He didn't move a muscle. He wasn't breathing hard from the work. He was just frozen, listening. It was the first time I noticed how quiet his house always was. No TV, no radio, no visitors. Just the hum of his industrial-sized freezer in the garage. Weeks went by, and the feeling of unease grew. I started noticing the cars. Different models, always older, parked a block away and never seen again. I told my wife, Julianne, that something felt wrong about the way Arthur looked at the delivery trucks. He didn't look for packages. He looked at the drivers. He was studying their routes. We laughed it off as my overactive imagination. I wanted to believe he was just a lonely guy with a weird hobby. Then came the night of the heavy rain. I was sitting in my darkened living room because I couldn't sleep. I saw Arthur walk out to his driveway, but he wasn't alone. A woman was with him. She looked dazed, walking with a strange, mechanical gait. I thought she was drunk. I watched them get into his car and drive away. 10 minutes later, Arthur came back alone. That was the point of no return. The weight of what I was seeing became too heavy to ignore. I didn't call the police right away. I did something stupider. I waited for him to go to work the next morning, and I walked over to his garage. The side door was unlocked. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't rot. It was bleach. Everything was too clean. The industrial freezer was humming in the corner, chained shut with a heavy padlock. I found a notebook on his workbench. I expected a list of victims or some manifesto. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a list of people Arthur had killed. It was a list of people who were already missing from the city, with detailed notes on where their bodies had been dumped by someone else. Arthur wasn't the killer. He was a collector. He was finding what the real monster left behind and bringing pieces of them home to keep them safe. I heard the garage door opener start to groan. Arthur was home early. I scrambled out the side door and back to my house, heart hammering against my ribs. I watched from my window as he walked into his garage, his expression as calm as ever. He knew someone had been in there. He looked directly at my window and gave a small, polite nod. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved that someone finally knew. The police raided his house 2 days later after I made an anonymous tip. They found the heads. They found the journals. They called him the Southside Butcher in the news. But as I sit in my new apartment 3 towns away, I keep thinking about the final page of that notebook. Arthur had written my name at the bottom of a list under the heading, Scheduled for Pickup. Beside my name, he hadn't written a location. He had written a time. It was the exact time I usually went for my morning walk, and the handwriting wasn't Arthur's. Before we continue, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to like and subscribe. It really motivates me to keep going. The banging started at 2 in the morning on my 3rd night in the new house. It wasn't a plumbing issue. Pipes rattle or whistle, but they don't strike the floorboards with rhythmic, deliberate force. I sat up in bed, staring at the shadows on my wall. It came from directly beneath my feet. 3 hits. A pause. 3 more hits. It sounded like someone was swinging a sledgehammer against the foundation. I moved into this place because the rent was low and the neighborhood was quiet. It was an old Victorian that had been split into 3 units. I was on the ground floor. The basement was supposed to be empty, just a place for the water heater and the furnace. The landlord, a man named Mr. Henderson, told me the door stayed locked for safety. He said there was nothing down there but dust and old cobwebs. On the fourth night, the sound changed. It wasn't a hammer anymore. It was a scraping sound, like metal being dragged across concrete. I stood in my kitchen, clutching a steak knife, listening to it move from one side of the house to the other. It followed my footsteps. When I walked to the sink, the scraping moved under the kitchen floor. When I ran to the hallway, it slid toward the front door. I couldn't breathe. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the hallway for nearly 10 minutes. My ears were ringing from the silence. I wanted to believe it was a stray dog or maybe a massive raccoon that had gotten into the crawl space. But animals don't mirror your movements. Animals don't wait for you to take a step before they take one too. I realized then that whatever was down there was listening to me just as hard as I was listening to it. I finally called Mr. Henderson the next morning. I told him I was leaving if he didn't let me see the basement. He didn't argue. He sounded tired, almost bored. He came over an hour later with a heavy brass key. He didn't speak as he led me to the small door under the stairs. He unlocked it and stepped back, gesturing for me to go first. I pulled a flashlight from my pocket and shone the beam into the dark. The basement was dry and surprisingly clean. There were no tools, no furniture, and no heavy objects that could make a banging sound. The floor was solid concrete, poured recently by the look of it. I walked the entire perimeter, checking the walls and the ceiling. Everything was empty. There was no way anyone could have been down here making those sounds. I felt a surge of embarrassment. I apologized to Henderson for wasting his time. He just nodded and locked the door. He left without saying a word. I felt a strange sense of relief as I went back to my living room. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind caught in the old vents. I spent the evening watching TV, trying to reclaim my sense of security. By midnight, I was almost convinced I had imagined the whole thing. I was brushing my teeth when the banging started again. This time, it was louder. It was so violent that the tiles under my feet began to crack. I dropped my toothbrush and stared at the floor. I saw a thin line of red liquid seeping up through the grout between the tiles. It wasn't rust from the pipes. It was thick and dark. I backed away, tripping over the rug, and scrambled toward the front door. I didn't stop running until I reached the 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. I called the police from a payphone. 2 officers went to the house while I waited, shivering in a booth. They came back 20 minutes later looking annoyed. They told me they found nothing. No blood, no cracks in the floor, and no signs of an intruder. They said the basement was exactly as I had described it, empty and quiet. I never went back for my things. I sent a moving company the next week, but they called me saying the house was gone, not burned down or demolished. They said the address I gave them led to a vacant lot with nothing but grass and a single concrete slab. I checked the local maps and my lease and even my GPS history. There was no record of a house ever existing on that plot of land, but I still have the key Mr. Henderson gave me. I found it in my pocket this morning, and when I hold it to my ear, I can hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the metal. I saw the man in the yellow windbreaker at the same spot every morning. He stood by the old stone bridge at 5:45 a.m., staring down into the dark water of the creek. I'm a creature of habit. I run 5 miles every day, rain or shine. I never talked to him, and he never looked at me. He was just a part of the scenery, like the oak trees or the rusted park benches. Until the morning, he wasn't there. I was halfway through my route when I saw the struggle. It was happening near the thicket of bushes about 50 yards past the bridge. A woman was on the ground, and a man was looming over her, his hands clamped around her throat. He wasn't wearing a yellow windbreaker. He was wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the shadows of the early dawn. I didn't think. I just acted. I screamed as loud as I could and charged toward them. The man looked up, his eyes wide with a strange kind of panic. He didn't try to fight me. He scrambled up and sprinted into the woods, disappearing into the heavy undergrowth. I reached the woman and knelt beside her. She was gasping for air, clutching her neck. There was blood on her hands. I pulled my phone out to call 911, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped it. "Did you see him?" she wheezed. Her voice was thin and raspy. "Did you see where he went?" I told her to stay still, that help was on the way. I stayed with her until the sirens started wailing in the distance. When the police arrived, they took my statement. I described the man in the hoodie perfectly. I told them about his height, his build, and the way he ran. I felt like a hero. I had saved someone's life. An officer named Detective Vance pulled me aside after the paramedics loaded the woman into the ambulance. He had a strange look on his face. He asked me to repeat my story. I did, emphasizing the man in the dark hoodie. Vance sighed and rubbed his face. He took a photo out of his pocket and showed it to me. It was the man in the yellow windbreaker I saw every morning. "This is Leo," the detective said. "He's been a local fisherman here for 20 years. We found him 10 minutes ago at the bottom of the creek. His throat was cut. Based on the temperature of the body, he was killed right about the time you started your jog." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. I told the detective that's impossible. I saw Leo every day. He was the one who was supposed to be at the bridge. Vance looked toward the ambulance. "The woman you saved is Claire Miller. She's been wanted in 3 states for armed robbery and assault." "The man in the hoodie? We think he was her partner. They probably had a falling out over the fisherman's wallet." I looked at the ambulance. Claire was sitting on the edge of the gurney, looking straight at me. She wasn't gasping anymore. She gave me a small, mocking smile before the doors closed. The silence of the park felt different now. Every shadow looked like a person waiting to strike. I realized my heroism was exactly what Claire had planned. She knew a runner passed by every morning at that exact time. She needed a witness to provide a description of a man who didn't exist, to draw the police away from the real crime. She had used me to cover up the murder of the man I had seen every morning for a year. I stopped running after that day. I couldn't handle the feeling of being watched. But yesterday, a package arrived at my door. There was no return address. Inside was a brand new, bright yellow windbreaker. It was exactly the same style and size as the one Leo used to wear. I checked the pockets, and at the very bottom, I found a small, laminated card. It was my own emergency contact card, the one I keep tucked inside my running shoe. It was stained with a single, dry thumbprint of blood. I live alone in a house that sits at the very end of a cul-de-sac. My backyard is mostly overgrown brush and a few tall oak trees that block the light even in the middle of the afternoon. It is a quiet place, or at least it was until 3 weeks ago. It started with the back gate. I always lock it with a heavy brass bolt, but every morning I would find it pushed open just a few inches. I told myself the wood was warping in the humidity. Then I found the bird feeder. It had been pulled down from the branch and placed neatly on the patio table. Not broken, not empty, just moved. I stood there for a full minute holding my coffee, looking at that feeder. It felt like a message I couldn't read. Night after night, the small things continued. I found a cigarette butt in the grass near the porch, though I have never smoked in my life. It was a brand I didn't recognize, unfiltered and crushed flat. I started double-checking the locks on my sliding glass doors twice every night. I felt a heavy weight in my chest whenever I had to go into the kitchen after dark. One Tuesday, I stayed up late to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was happening. I turned off all the lights in the house and sat on the floor by the window. I stayed there for 3 hours, watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the lawn. The motion light finally kicked on at 2:14 in the morning. I didn't see a person at first. I just saw the light flood the yard, turning everything a harsh, artificial white. Then I saw a movement near the shed. A figure was standing there. It was a woman named Claire who used to work at the library where I spend my weekends. I hadn't spoken to her in months. She wasn't looking at the house. She was wearing a yellow raincoat that I recognized immediately. It was my raincoat, the one that had gone missing from my hall closet 2 weeks ago. I watched her through the glass. She wasn't trying to get in. She was pacing the perimeter of the fence, touching the wood with her fingertips like she was measuring something. She stopped at the center of the yard and pulled a small notebook from her pocket. She began to write frantically, looking up at my bedroom window every few seconds. I realized then that she wasn't hiding. She wanted me to see her. She wanted me to know she was there. I reached for my phone on the counter, my hand shaking so hard I almost dropped it. When I looked back out, she was gone. The yard was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the sofa with a kitchen knife in my lap until the sun came up. The next morning, I walked out into the yard to find the notebook she had been writing in. I found it tucked under the bird feeder. I opened the first page, expecting to see threats or rambling nonsense. Instead, the notebook was filled with a minute-by-minute log of my own life. It listed the time I brushed my teeth, the brand of cereal I ate, and the exact moment I turned off my bedside lamp. The log didn't stop at the previous night. I flipped to the very last page, and my heart stopped. The final entry was dated for today, but the time was listed as 10 p.m. tonight. It simply read, "He forgets to lock the basement window when the rain starts." I looked up at the sky. It was a clear, blue morning without a cloud in sight. But as I stood there, I felt the first cold drop of water hit my forehead. I walked to the basement window and looked down. The latch was sitting on the floor inside the house, cleanly unscrewed from the frame. The car ride was wrong from the very first mile. Julian didn't look at me once. He kept his eyes fixed on the road. His hands gripped so tight on the steering wheel that his knuckles were white. We were supposed to go to a small bistro in town for our third date. Instead, he took a sharp turn onto a Forest Service road that led deep into the state park. I asked him where we were going, but he just reached over and turned the radio up until the speakers rattled. The music was a high-pitched, distorted jazz that made my teeth ache. This wasn't the man I had spent the last 2 weeks texting. The pavement ended, and the car began to bounce over deep ruts in the dirt. Tall pines crowded the sides of the road, their branches scraping against the windows. I told him I wanted to go home. I told him I was feeling sick. Julian didn't answer. He just drove faster, the speedometer climbing as the road grew narrower. I reached for the door handle, but I heard the electronic thud of the child locks engaging. My stomach dropped. I realized I didn't actually know anything about him. We had met on an app. We had shared some coffee. That was all. He slammed on the brakes so hard I jerked forward against the seatbelt. We were in a clearing where the trees had been cleared away. It was pitch black outside, save for the glow of the dashboard. Julian turned off the engine. The silence was worse than the music. He sat there for a long time, staring at the glove box. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was waiting for him to reach for me or get out of the car. He just sat there, breathing heavily through his nose. He looked like he was fighting the urge to cry. He finally spoke, but his voice was a whisper. He told me to get out and run. He said it without looking at me. I asked him what he meant, but he grabbed my shoulder and shoved me toward the passenger door. He reached across me and manually unlocked it from his side. He told me to run into the trees and not to look back, no matter what I heard. I didn't ask questions. I scrambled out of the car and sprinted into the dark woods. I could hear him screaming behind me, but it wasn't a scream of anger. It sounded like he was in pain. I hid behind a large fallen log and watched the car. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The headlights were still on, cutting 2 yellow tunnels into the brush. I saw a second set of lights approaching from the way we had come. A black SUV pulled up behind Julian's car. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing masks. They were wearing high-visibility vests like road workers. They walked up to Julian's window and pulled him out of the car. He didn't fight them. They looked like they were professionals. One of the men looked toward the woods where I was hiding. He held up a thermal scanner and pointed it in my direction. I ducked lower, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard them talking, their voices calm and clinical. They weren't looking for a victim. They were looking for a product. One of them said that the bait had worked and that Julian would be disposed of for failing to follow the protocol. They stayed for an hour, cleaning the car with bleach and vacuuming the interior. When they left, the clearing was empty. There was no sign that Julian or I had ever been there. I walked 3 miles to a gas station and called the police. They told me there was no record of any Julian in the county and that the road I described had been decommissioned and gated off since the 90s. Arthur was the kind of friend you meet when you really need one. I had just moved to the city and didn't know a soul. We met at a used bookstore in the basement of an old apartment building. He recommended a thriller, I bought it, and we ended up grabbing a beer next door. He was funny, self-deprecating, and seemed to have an endless supply of stories about his travels. Within a month, we were hanging out 3 or 4 times a week. He felt like the brother I never had. The first crack showed up during dinner at my place. Arthur was telling a story about a summer he spent in Italy. He mentioned a specific restaurant in Florence that I happened to have visited with my parents years ago. When I asked him what he thought of the owner, a boisterous man with a prosthetic arm, Arthur went completely still. He agreed that the man was a character, but the owner of that restaurant didn't have a prosthetic arm. I had made that up on the spot. Arthur hadn't caught the lie because he had never been to Italy. I didn't say anything that night. I just watched him. Over the next few days, I started noticing other small things. Arthur would sometimes call me by a name that wasn't mine. He would answer his phone and speak in a language I couldn't identify, his voice dropping to a low, guttural growl. I decided to follow him after he left my apartment on a Friday night. He told me he was going home to sleep, but he walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction and entered a high-rise office building that was supposed to be vacant for renovations. I waited across the street, hidden in the shadow of a bus stop. I saw a light flick on the 12th floor. Through the window, I could see Arthur moving around. He wasn't sleeping. He was pinning things to a large corkboard. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I went home and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just a lonely guy who exaggerated his life to feel important. We continued our friendship for another week, but the warmth was gone. Every time he smiled at me, I saw the effort it took to keep his expression in place. One afternoon, Arthur left his leather satchel at my house after we watched a game. He was halfway down the block when I saw it tucked under the sofa. I told myself I would just put it on the counter for him, but the strap was loose, and a folder slid out onto the floor. Inside were several dossiers. One was on me. It contained my birth certificate, my banking records, and a photo of my elementary school graduation. But the other dossiers were even more disturbing. They were files on 3 other men in the city. All of them looked exactly like me. I heard the front door click open. Arthur hadn't knocked. He walked into the living room and saw me holding the folder. He didn't look angry or embarrassed. He just looked tired. He sat down in the armchair and asked me if I liked the life he had built for me. He told me that the real Arthur had died years ago, and that he was just a curator. He explained that my life was a mess before we met, and he had stepped in to fix the details. He had cleared my debts, influenced my job promotion, and steered me toward people he thought were good for me. He leaned forward and patted my knee. His hand felt cold, like stone. He told me that I wasn't the first version of myself he had managed, and I wouldn't be the last. I started to scream, but I realized I couldn't make a sound. My throat felt tight, as if the muscles had forgotten how to work. Arthur stood up and adjusted my collar. He told me it was time for my evening walk, just like we had planned. I found myself standing up and walking toward the door, my legs moving without my permission. As we stepped out into the hallway, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I realized I couldn't remember what color my eyes were supposed to be.